Hello, and welcome to the first episode from Internal Audit Executive Services. This is going to be a series where we're going to share with you some insights on internal audit. I'm here with the partner and founder of Internal Audit Executive Services, Craig Carter, and Craig's going to share a little bit with us around the overall cycle. My name is Roy Hincamper. I'm a senior advisor with Internal Audit Executive Services, and I've been working with Craig for a number of years through our experiences, not only in this venture, but prior to this with our professional backgrounds, as we were both with a Big Four CPA firm together. Craig, how you doing today?
I'm just fine, Roy. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well, as always. How's the weather in the Dallas-Fort Worth area?
Trending a little bit cooler, thank goodness.
Yeah, I think
needed that.
For sure. We're seeing the same here in St. Louis. It's a nice, bright, sunny day out, but yeah, it's a bit more chilly than we've had. So it's starting to feel like fall, starting to feel like football weather. You know, I love that. So,
well, Roy, again, good to see you. Thank you for taking the time today to wire this up together. What I thought we would do is introduce a topic, which is the internal audit life cycle. And over the next set of weeks, once a week, kind of drain and explain aspects of that internal audit life cycle to our audience. And they can get to us either on our website at internalauditexecutives.com or through our YouTube channel. But today's content will start with really the heart of what makes internal audit and what determines the internal audit focus, and that is the internal audit strategy. And then we'll try to move into the annual cadence of those activities that internal audit does throughout the year. Now, instead of reading, I could read the bullets under each slide, but I'll probably simply highlight one or two areas and comment on them. And then after we go through the 5 phases of the life cycle, I'll come back and ask questions of you.
sure.
Just to make sure you're carrying your weight on this video, although you have all the technical components mastered and have ensured it will not be screwed up by me having to push any buttons.
I was mentored well.
Then we'll close and talk about what will come up next week and discuss.
Fantastic.
Does that make sense?
Fantastic. That makes good sense to me. Let's
and you have a slide deck you may show simultaneously, which will divert their attention away from you looking at notes, correct?
Yep, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Let me go ahead and get that fired up so that the folks can see it and we can move on from there. So,
well, let me start by talking about who we are. Internal Audit Executive Services is a network of former Big Four internal audit partners, all of which have one thing in common. They were in the Big Four, but before they were in the Big Four or after, they also served as chief audit executives in industry. So each of us bring extensive experience. In my case, it's about 38 years. Spent the first 20 in industry and the last 17, 18 in the Big Four. But most specifically, we're focused on assisting internal audit functions in improving their performance. We don't do outsourcing. We do not want to do the job of internal audit functions. We want to provide the tools and the experience and the advice that help them to do it better.
Yep.
So today we'll be talking about the content, as I mentioned earlier, the internal audit life cycle. And as we work with different clients, we provide a lot of different services. They really fall into 3 different categories. Quality assessment reviews, which are really based on the internal, the IAES guidelines themselves. The IAEA looks for participating internal audit functions that are certified to have a quality assessment review every 5 years. At the center, you'll see internal audit strategy and execution. That's a range of services that follow the life cycle of internal audit itself. And lastly, leadership can't read that last word, but it's coaching and CAE assistance, which is designed a set of services, again, to supplement what you have in place, not replace what you have in place.
Yeah. And
So as we look at, you have a comment, Roy?
Oh, I was just going to say, you know, it's one of the things that we had talked about as we started on this adventure was there's so many providers out there that, you know, augment what internal audit does and provide that outsourcing and co-sourcing. And, you know, don't get me wrong, there are providers out there that do a lot of the things that we have talked about in terms of, you know, the leadership and coaching, the QARs, and the strategy and execution, but coming at it with a focus on that and really focusing on the way that internal audit functions operate and the way that internal audit functions do that, and to be a resource for the chief audit executive and for the rest of internal audit leadership is not something that is very common out there in the marketplace. And it's one of the reasons that we've enjoyed this relationship and working together and working with CAEs is to have a focus that is very targeted on that and not on all of the other things that, you know, outside providers do for risk functions and for internal audit functions.
I totally agree, Roy. That reminds me of one of my favorite mentors, Gary Duchesne. When I joined KPMG and we were talking about the service offerings, he said, look, if a client will pay us the right rate per hour, we'll pick broccoli. And what he was saying is that we'll meet whatever the firm has the capabilities to meet whatever need that the client has. From our focus, even though we have the experience to meet those most every need, instead we want to focus on the things, existing internal audit functions, and give them the tools and the experience and the advice that allow them to build a stronger function.
Yep.
Again, we're not about replacing a function or doing the work for them, but in many cases, we believe there can be better tools to do that, and that informs our service.
Yep, absolutely.
But
so Craig,
as you think about it, I'm sorry, I interrupted you again. All right, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Craig.
You start with the heart of the matter. At the center of the internal audit viewpoint, you have to start with internal audit strategy. And the reason that you start with internal audit strategy in our experience is that the function cannot be a static function. It has to continue to grow and evolve with the business. And the way it does that really is called out in the first bullet on the slide, that the internal audit mission determines the internal audit charter and the focus and how it's positioned in the business and what it can do. And then what follows that are the people that you have and you staff it with, what their skill sets are, and then these other things, audit methodologies and processes and procedures and quality improvement programs and things of the like, training and coaching to supplement it. But the key point here, it's not static. If you don't retouch it every year, and if it's not aligned with the needs of the business, then it's not going to be able to deliver against stakeholder expectations. And as former chief audit executives, meeting those stakeholder expectations is not an easy thing to do because they are so diverse. I mean, just think about who the stakeholders are, right? They're audit committee chairs that have a point of view. All of them come, nowadays, most of them are all well-grounded in audit procedures and accounting. They have a perspective. The CFO is certainly, and the controller are certainly key stakeholders. They know what their functions are doing, what finance is doing, and what is accounting doing, what technologies are in place, how it should be done. And they have a view about what you should be working with a focus on. And then you have the business process owners themselves within the business who you're interacting with. So it's a very complex range. So if you look at it on an annual basis, there with the internal audit strategy at the center, there are
Right.
really 5 phases that we have broken out. This is not coming from a textbook. This is coming from our experience in leading internal audit functions and working with internal audit functions. And I'm going to start on the top right, and I'm going to move around the cycle that has at the core the internal audit strategy, because it determines the focus. The first is establishing the risk profile. Obviously, there are several steps associated with that, but given the mission does, in turn has a lens by which you then look at the audit universe and that profile.
Right.
The second, whether you're on an annual cycle that starts on a calendar year end or on a mid-year year end, it doesn't matter. The second step is developing the internal audit plan. Once that plan is developed, locked and loaded and agreed with the stakeholders, you move to performing reviews. And then this fourth step, at least in our perspective, is a little bit different than what you may see in the internal audit literature, and that is agreeing and communicating results. And the reason it's pulled out, in my view, it needs a specific focus above just writing the internal audit report and publishing the internal audit report and reporting to the audit committee, is that if the agreement of those results are not aligned with the people that you audited, then you're going to have a hard time selling that in the improvement plan to the audit committee and having management execute against that plan. And the secret sauce is having the recommendations followed and having any gaps that are identified closed. And last, what you'll normally see following is the last phase in all the literature is assessing stakeholder experience. And we have a view on that as well. Any comment on those 5?
You know, Craig, I think you make,
Roy?
yeah, I think you make a very good point on the, you know, the time you spent on the agree and communicate. And, you know, I think the whole way that we spell out the life cycle and the way that we talk about it, with focusing on that strategy in the middle and making sure that each of those parts of the life cycle that go around really stay grounded within that strategy. Because once you start to get away from that, you start to create in that last assess stakeholder experience piece questions of your stakeholders of what you're really doing, because you've moved away from the strategy in your execution. So that's absolutely key as you walk through it.
I think I'm going to come back later in the session and try to pin you down on that, because I think that's a very telling comment that you just shared.
Yep.
So let's go back to the 5 phases and let's start to blow them out. I'm not going to read these bullets. I can't even if I wanted to, because Roy has the image of himself and me, who's very, you know, disconcerting to see yourself waving your hands like John Madden in front of the text anyway. But I'll highlight on each one of these 5 phases an area that I want to focus on. The first one, under establishing the risk profile, there's a strategic plan alignment. If there's one thing that I believe that you have to get right as an internal audit practitioner, as a CAE, and gain consensus among those stakeholders, is that you have to develop an internal audit plan and address that risk universe against the things that matter to the business. And those are always articulated in the strategic plan. And from there, you can then ask the question, if these are articulated in our 3 to 5 year vision, well, what do we also see in our strategic planning process that may become emerging risk that we need to reserve time in our internal audit plan to address later on?
Right.
I'll
That's spot on.
then move to the second one, which is developing the internal audit plan. Now that sounds very mechanical. However, it has several different factors as one can suppose. You have to, as I said earlier, you have to make decisions about how you're going to divvy up what you're going to focus on. How much financial risk are you going to focus on in your plan relative to legal and regulatory compliance risk, relative to emerging risk, relative to operational risk. And I will tell you, in my experience, there is not a formula. And if there was, unlike Google, unlike Facebook, there's no secret algorithm that will watch your behavior and your behavior of your stakeholders and then spit out and say, this is what your internal audit plan will look like.
Right.
But I will also say that as you develop that internal audit plan, that you need to reserve the flexibility to make changes over time. And best practice internal audit functions, they reserve the time for management directed and management discretionary reviews. Most of those reviews, in my experience in industry, are directed at those emerging risks or areas where subsequently an event has exposed a perceived gap and audit hours may need to be applied against it.
Yep.
All of these applications, whether it is applying internal audit hours against legal and regulatory compliance, let's think about Foreign Corrupt Practices Act,
Right.
or anti-money laundering, or whether you're applying them against operational risk, or whether you're applying them against emerging risk that's come from a business acquisition. The value of internal audit is driven by how well your internal audit plan matches the needs of the business to answer questions, to close gaps in those areas. So let's move to the third one, which is performing internal audit reviews. Now this one seems the most mundane. Well, if I have a plan, well,
Right.
I got to execute it, right?
Exactly.
But again, it's not quite as simple as that, because as you're developing the work plan, you don't start with a library. And this is my biggest discovery in industry. I said, well, look, I'll just go to the library.
Right.
They wanted me to do an audit against the cost accounting, the government cost accounting standards. Well, fine, I'll just go to the library of existing audits and I'll pull down, cost accounting standard number umpty-ump, and I'll do that audit. Well, in most companies, that doesn't exist.
Right.
And what even in the best companies, what exists are the audits of operational areas, of legal and regulatory areas, where you can go to specialists and look at their work programs. But even those need to be adapted to the times and to the situation. So what that drives is a testing approach and then audit techniques. And increasingly what we're seeing is that we want to use as much automated testing as we can. We want to use as much continuous monitoring as we can. So what are those different applications of audit of our actual work plan? How can we continually monitor so that we can evaluate and validate that after we've audited it, management's corrective action is closing the gap?
Yep. And it's a good point, because as you and I both know, within the internal audit world, we have talked about analytics and continuous monitoring, continuous auditing for years and years and years, about being a leading practice. And we're still in that spot where it is. And the challenge for so many organizations is figuring out how to get the technology to work effectively so that you are able to do those audits using the effective analytics that test what you really want to test. There's a lot of analytics that you can run that don't really get at the heart of the matter, don't really address the risk that you're looking for. But can you start to design a system that not only tests those things, but also monitors them long term? And that still, it remains a challenge for so many functions, so many internal audit groups, so many companies, quite frankly, in monitoring the business.
Well, if you think about it, though, it's because they're not working from a monolithic
Right.
universe of systems and processes.
Yep.
The company could have grown through acquisition.
Yep.
The data sets and the data definitions underneath one system doesn't match another system. Over time, I think those would be refined, but increasingly we're seeing companies start to deal with the metadata
Mm-hmm.
by extracting the data out of these diverse systems. And I think we're going to see major leaps forward in this area for internal audit, but it's not a simple process. And the key, as you said earlier, is identifying the right audit risk,
Right.
not
Well,
identifying the audit risk that you can validate.
right. Well, and it goes back to that point you made a minute ago of there not being a library of audit procedures out there because the risk has changed. So even if you have something, you need to update it for what we're dealing with now, not what we dealt with when we developed that.
And point well taken. As you go to the fourth phase, agree and communicate results. Now don't panic, because we have in here all the report writing stuff, the management action plan, and the issue and action tracking. Issue and action tracking, by the way, is one whole area that's also targeted for a lot of leading practice functions are targeting it for future automation.
Yep.
But the key here, in my view, is obtaining that stakeholder agreement and having the presentation of the facts and the findings in such a way that the business process owners or the subject of the audit themselves says, you're right, that's the right risk, that was the right way to test whether that risk was being covered and is mitigated, and then determining what can be done to close that risk. Therefore, we decided, in our view, instead of calling it report writing and communication, that it's really the agreement is the key.
Yep.
Because if you don't have that agreement of who you're auditing with, then your whole standing with that key stakeholder, that critical stakeholder, who is being
Mm-hmm.
audited, if you don't have that alignment, then it doesn't matter what comes next.
Yeah, that's so well stated, Craig. And part of that is things that you and I have seen and experienced in the past, where you sat in front of a committee. Kind of the end of that particular cycle is the reporting to the audit committee, and you see the committee looking at two sets of facts in their mind in front of them, one from the side of the auditor, one from the side of the process owner, and trying to figure out which one to believe. So getting
How do
that
you
alignment.
reconcile those two?
Yeah,
Well, if you ever
exactly.
get in the situation where you have to reconcile a point of view versus another point of view, you're done.
Yeah,
You're already done.
you've dropped the ball. You've dropped the ball already on the on the first bullet that we have here, which is the agreement of facts and findings.
Well, exactly right. Well, as you move to the fifth area, and this is no more than the Stephen Covey and sharpening the saw, obviously, which is an allusion to 7 habits of highly effective people. An internal audit function is more than just a function or a department. It is a living and breathing thing that is made up of individuals, all of which with their own goals and objectives. And that internal audit strategy at the center of this is really what directs them in such a way that they are applying their skills
Right.
against the internal audit focus, are using the training programs, the value scorecards, and everything else to validate that they delivered what they promised they would have delivered, but also developing themselves as future business leaders within that business, whether they go on to become a CAE, whether they go on to become a business process owner. The richness, I believe, that internal audit lends to an organization is the ability to see the organization from the lens of risk and compliance, and the solutions needed to achieve the right balance of risk coverage and growth within that business. So this pretty much summarizes our view, at least, of the internal audit life cycle. Again, this happens on an annual basis, whether you start it in January or whether you start it in July, doesn't matter, or any other, dictated by year end. These are the key activities, and over the next set of videos, we would like to take each one of them and drain a little bit deeper specifically with a focus on problem areas or areas where we think internal audit can sharpen the saw
Right.
and improve their delivery and get a better match against meeting the needs of the business.
Yep.
So right now, this is my favorite part of the session. I get to put you on the spot. And I don't have these questions memorized, but I'm going to select out of I did share 12 of them, but I'm only going to ask 3 just because I know 12 is too much for you to prepare. So here's the first question. Just how important is the alignment of the annual internal audit plan against the company's strategic plan?
There's 2 different answers to that, and one is the value that you get for the company, and the other one is the value of internal audit. And if you're a CAE, if you're a leader in internal audit, both are important. There was one company that I worked for that was privately held, and when people asked me what we did in internal audit, my answer was, I'm looking out for his money. And that was the short answer. So, what we did as internal audit was we were trying to protect the owner's money in my view. So from a value standpoint, we just tried to design internal audit around not only the controls that protected him in our current state, but also looking at where were we going? What are the things that are going to happen next? And how can we help to not necessarily craft in terms of design, but how can we help identify areas where those future plans, those future strategies might have a hiccup somewhere along the lines because of a concern or because of something that we may see emerging out on the front. So that's the first thing that I think of on tying it, is that when you're really looking towards the going concern of the business and you're really considering how can we add value to the company, that's a critical point. And if you're not focused on the future strategy of the organization, it's going to be very hard for you to demonstrate that value externally, which then leads to the second point, which you want to focus on the strategy of the company so that you do position your internal audit function effectively and you are a value added function. And if you're basically, that old vision that we had, I can't remember who did the commercial years ago, where it was just people marching in a black and white thing, and you could see the guys with the stamp that were just stamping papers and handing them over. You don't want internal audit to have that type of a vision where we do the same thing over and over and over again, and we're not really bringing value to the organization. And there's a lot of different ways that internal audit can bring value, but by focusing specifically on the strategy of the organization, where the organization wants to go, you'll be able to unlock areas where you bring insights and value that probably aren't being considered by others, or you're validating that they've already considered it and they've got it covered, both of which is going to be valuable for the shareholders, for your board, for your audit committee, and for other stakeholders involved.
Yeah, I think that's a very complete answer. If you think about the strategic plan and you boil it down to its essence, it's where the company is making its bets. It's where the company is going to put its money.
Yep.
And those bets and those areas, they carry all the different type of risk that you see in COSO. It's going to be strategic risk.
Yep.
It's going to be operational risk. It's going to be legal and regulatory risk, as well as financial risk. So again, now you're getting into the richness of the internal audit plan and why the internal audit plan needs to be dynamic.
Yep.
To address that risk. Let me try another question. You did so well on that one. So here's a question, Rory. Why take the time to undertake an internal audit capabilities assessment every year?
It's funny because I've talked to different CAEs that have different processes for this, and I can relate to one of the things that we did when I was in industry, and I can also talk about some things that I've seen here. And, some have a very formal process to go through. Some are a little more informal and may not do something formal on an annual basis. But the leading practice institutions always have a formal evaluation that they do at some point in time. And part of the reason that they have that formal evaluation is because what it does is it gives you a snapshot objective of what your skill sets are, what your people's capabilities are, but also, and this is where the annual part comes into it, when you're designing that internal audit plan and you're identifying the types of audits that you need to do and how that ties into the strategic plan, you're probably going to identify gaps and places where you may or may not be able to execute on part of your internal audit plan, or may not be able to add the value to the overall organization without that capabilities assessment. And then you've got a decision to make. Do you hire for that talent? Do you have the capability to do that? Do you outsource it? Do you pull somebody in from outside that has that expertise that can do it? Uh, do you go ahead and train for those skills?
Mhm.
Once again, I think about, and I still think this is a great hiring practice, is that you always hire for attitude and work ethic, and you can train for skill. Well, this is one of those areas where you can look at what your capabilities are, and if you've got the opportunity and the time and the wherewithal to train for the skill, you can. Otherwise, you've got to bring it in from the outside somehow. And that's one of the key areas where it can be the difference between an internal audit function bringing value and not. I think we've all seen situations where we've said, well, our department is smart, they'll figure it out. And the type of value they can bring in delivering on that audit plan may or may not be successful.
Yeah.
And so I think that capabilities assessment, particularly in light of what you need from an audit plan standpoint, is absolutely critical every year.
Oh, I think you're right. I mean, you bring another point to mind. Now, not only should that capabilities assessment drive the training plan, but it should also inform what tools are needed for the auditors to execute against it.
Right.
So it's not a small thing. And again, I go back to what our focus as internal audit executive services is, and that is to help existing internal audit functions and not to replace them, but
Right.
help them to organically grow those capabilities. And so
Absolutely.
that capability assessment really is a key component that should be done annually because your personnel mix changes
Right.
annually. Okay, last question because we're running out of time. Uh, so why did you break out agree and communicate results as a separate phase? Is it really that important in your experience?
We touched on this a little bit earlier. On there's no worse situation than sitting in front of the audit committee on the reporting end and saying, okay, management has one view of this, internal audit has another view of it. Because what that tells them is that one or both of you don't really know the facts. You don't really have a good grasp upon what's going on here. And you're putting them in the position of trying to referee and figure that out. And there's no committee that really wants to do that, number one. There's no set of senior leaders, your C-level executives, that really want to do that. And quite frankly, you're putting question into all of their minds about the ability of the function to work with management. They may realize that, hey, this particular process owner is a pretty difficult person to work with, but they also may recognize that in that particular area of the business, they get results. The opposite may be true. They may be questioning somebody and their overall performance and looking for something to come out of internal audit. That's not usually the case, but when you have these situations that come up where you haven't agreed upon the basic facts, there's a lot of questions that get raised both about the stakeholder or the process owner and the internal audit function. And those are just difficult situations. They're the types of things that you don't really want to be in the middle of and that you don't really want to deal with, and I shudder to use this term, but I'll use it anyway. It just makes for a very difficult political situation, and it makes for a very difficult messaging from an internal audit standpoint. So you really want to make sure that you've got the facts straight and that the management agrees upon those facts. Yeah, other things as an internal audit executive that it might tell you is it might give you a clue as to the skill sets and capabilities of your team, which we just talked about. Sometimes seeing them on the front line and dealing with some of these things really brings some of those things to bear, and then will influence your training program down the road. So those are some of the high level reasons that I think of on trying to make sure that we've got an agreement on the facts and findings, because once you have that, your work as an internal audit function may not necessarily be bulletproof, but but it's certainly a lot less flimsy when you've got everybody sitting around the table saying, yes, it's an issue, yes, it's a problem, and yes, this is how we're going to fix it, and we all agree that all of those are the case.
Appreciate it, Roy. I also appreciate you volunteering for the Q&A session. I thought you did an excellent job, and I'm relieved that I didn't have to do that. Well, let's talk a little bit in summary. What we've done today is talk about the centrality of the internal audit strategy and how it drives the activity on an annual basis of an internal audit function.
Yep.
We also talked about in some depth each of these 5 phases of the internal audit life cycle, and highlighted areas that in our experience that one should keep top of mind as you undergo these activities. Over the next couple of weeks, what I'd like to propose is that we would take each one of these and drill further into each. Next week, specifically looking at the establishing the risk profile with the special emphasis on how you develop that risk assessment. As we do that, I would challenge those that are listening to think about their internal audit function, how they are currently positioned, what their current internal audit focus is, where they fall on the spectrum, and how well their internal audit program is aligned to meet the business needs, and how do they evidence that? Because I think that the real question in delivering value is to be able to evidence that value and getting the consensus from your key stakeholders that is what the function in truth is delivering. Roy, any closing comments before we pull this to an end?
You know, I would just add that, the slide we've got up right now really gets to the heart of the matter and gets to the heart of what we talk about and have our conversations, and that we talk about with clients of internal audit executive services, which, are you aligned to meet your business needs, and where do you want to go? And that's really the question. And there's going to be some functions that want to sit in a traditional state, want to be enhanced, and want to sit right there for now, versus those that really want to be on the cutting edge. So you've got to evaluate that, and getting from whatever point you are to where you want to be is something that we've really focused on and developed our service line around. And even if you're not thinking about that, it's something to at least spend a little bit of time considering and work with your other stakeholders and your audit committee to kick around. And obviously, shameless plug here, if you'd like our help with that, we would love to be able to do that. You could certainly reach out to us. You can call Craig directly down in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, reach out to me, reach out to our other colleague, Sue, and we would absolutely love to be able to kick some things around with you, talk with you about it, and help you improve your function.
Thanks, Roy. Appreciate the time and finding a way to videotape me in my COVID cave.
Hey, happy to do it, Craig, and look forward to catching up with you next week or maybe in a couple weeks, because we haven't decided yet who's got the con on the next one. So
Thanks all. Everybody stay safe. Take care.
Take care.